Welcome to our Wednesday night study on the teachings of Jesus, and we've basically taken kind of as a case study the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we started out with kind of the prologue where Jesus talks about attitudes, and then after wrapping up what we call the Beatitudes, that happiness or the state of being blessed is not contingent on circumstances, it's an internal thing. He's now going to get into the main part of the discourse, and although the Beatitudes might have been counterintuitive, they were not controversial. This next section may seem to be a bit controversial. So he begins to tell his audience that if you do these things and you live with these principles, you'll be salt and you'll be light. And then we get to verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Everyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus begins with the Beatitudes. This is how you live in spite of your circumstances. And then he gives this disclaimer. I don't want you to think that I've come to destroy. Now, anytime anybody starts a statement, hey, I don't want you to get mad. I don't want you to think I'm angry. I don't want to hurt your feelings. You already know what's happening. I'm about to say something that fits that category. I'm about to say something to you that makes you think that. Jesus has warned his audience, I'm about to tell you some things that looks like I'm abolishing or upending the law. But really what he's doing, he's telling them how to feel full the requirements that God gives them. And then he says this shocking statement. Unless your righteousness exceeds, unless it surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you can't go to heaven. Now, one of my friends says that Jesus is raising the bar, that Jesus is trying to inspire his audience. Look at these guys, look at the Pharisees, look at the teachers of the law. They're the varsity, and unless you do better than them, unless you really up your game, you can't go to heaven. I don't see it that way. I see this as not an inspiration, but an indictment. He's looking at them and saying, you have been being taught about your relationship with God by people who build their image of relationship with God based on a series of pillars, and those pillars are built on external things. And he'll attack those pillars one at a time. He'll talk about the legalistic obedience of moral code. He'll talk about the way that you perform spiritual disciplines for man's benefit and your personal praise rather than devotion to God. He'll talk about their relationship with material things, and then he'll say that a lot of times these guys had a self-selected criterion, and that when they talked about their righteousness, it was always in comparison to other people. So Jesus is going to attack the external righteousness of the Pharisees in this series. So this is going to sound controversial. He starts out with, I don't want you to think I've come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill it. I'm going to show you how my interpretation of my Father's will surpasses their interpretation of the written document, the written traditions, and the oral traditions of the rabbis. And it's really the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is going to be a discussion or a discourse of internals versus externals. And he starts out with some of their moral obligations. Now, in telling his audience, look, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Basically, everything that was required in the law, Jesus is going to fulfill. Not just in his teaching, his interpretation of this is how you do it right, but he's also going to become the supreme sacrifice. He's going to become the propitiation and the expiation. He'll serve as a type of Passover lamb. He'll serve as a type of Yom Kippur lamb. He'll end up being the only high priest that we ever need. So he's going to take everything that was required in the law and he's going to fulfill it either in his life, his teachings, or his ministry. And he says, you need to understand that nothing in the law will be done away with until it's fulfilled. And he uses this phrase in one of the older translations. It says, not one jot or one tittle. And depending on how you understand that, as they wrote in the Hebrew language, a jot was like a small dot, the smallest letter. We would use iota or iota in the Greek alphabet. A tittle was the embellishment of the end of a letter or an ink drag. If you've ever drawn with a pen and ink set and you dip the pen in and you draw and then you move and you get a little fiber attached to the tip of your pen and it drags across your page. That's a tittle. Or think about the embellishment of the end of a T when you cross the letter T and you drag it out. He says, listen, nothing, not even a pen stroke in the law is going to disappear until it has been fulfilled. Not going to destroy it, going to fulfill it. And then he begins to talk about how the Pharisees taught that you fulfilled moral obligations. And he's going to talk about how God expects us to do this. And remember, in Jesus' teaching, it's always going to be God-focused, going to be God first. That once we understand a relationship with God, it dictates behavioral change. We live the way we live because we're connected to God. It's never we're connected to God because of the way we live. So as Jesus begins to talk about these internals versus externals, notice that he takes on either the interpretation or the traditions of the rabbis. He doesn't say that the law of Moses says this. He says, you've heard. This is their interpretation of the law of Moses. You've heard it said by people long ago, do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother, Rakah, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the council, or be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. The first thing he talks about is the idea of murder and hate. Now there's lots of Hebrew words that mean kill, but in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments, and in this verse here, the specific word murder is here. This is not talking about police officers or soldiers or people who have had to defend themselves. This is murder. He said, now you've heard it said, don't murder. I have the privilege of traveling around the country and speaking at lots of events. And sometimes those events have had me discuss, the Sermon on the Mount. I've never, ever asked in an audience and said, hey, anybody here got any problem with you kill people? Nobody's ever raised their hand. The one or two people who would talk to you afterwards and go, yeah, I've killed somebody, it was either that they were a soldier or they were a cop. Most religious people don't have a problem with murder. I got asked one time to drive 3 hours, speak 30 minutes on a summer series, and drive 3 hours back. I said, okay, I'll think about doing that. They said, our topic is, thou shalt not kill. I said, I think I'll pass on that. I just don't think it's a big brotherhood problem. You don't go to a place and find, that our people are killing each other. Most of us would say, yeah, that's not a thing that I'm tempted with. That's not a thing that ever crossed my mind. If you read Colonel Grossman's book on killing, the majority of us are incapable of it. The vast majority of people who have the capacity for killing is very small. Those that have the capacity for killing, even a small portion of those are good at it, and a smaller portion of those are good at it and enjoy it. That's what we call a sociopath. That's not really what we have in church. And so most of the time, if you looked at just that criterion, I've never killed anybody. Most people in the sound of my voice have never put their hands on somebody in anger. Most of us have never even committed any violence. Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't murder. Everybody gets their boxes out. Yep, never murdered anybody. But I say to you, you ever been angry with somebody without a cause? You ever looked at somebody and thought in your heart, you fool, you idiot, you dweeb, dork, insert a racial slur, queer? Well, I've never killed anybody. But I've looked at some people who were created in the image of God and who Jesus came to die for, and I've given them those labels, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my heart. See, the difference in murder and hate is one is external and one is internal. You go into a building and you shoot a bunch of people, people know that. You go into a building and shake people's hands and hug their neck and smile nicely and despise them because of their color, their age, their race, what they wear, what they don't wear. You pat yourself on the back, well, at least I didn't kill anybody. Just, I want you to understand, if you look at somebody and you say rekah, which is very close to an Aramaic word that means empty-headed one, or you look at somebody and you despise them, you fool. Jesus is not talking about the words rekah or the word fool. He's talking about the attitude that produces that. He says that'll put you in danger of being in front of the council. That'll put you in danger of being cast into the fire. Now the word he uses here for fire is Gehenna. Gehenna was a deep valley on the southern end of the city of Jerusalem. They'd done some human sacrifices there during the terrible reigns of some of the Old Testament kings, and it was basically now used as a perpetually burning dump. And Jesus used this valley that they were familiar with as an image of hell, where the fire's never quenched and the worm does not die. And Jesus said, yeah, okay, so you've never killed anybody? Be careful how you look at people. Be careful how you think about people. And then he says, if you're coming to church, if you're bringing your offering, and you remember your brother has something against you. Now, this doesn't say that when you get here and you recognize, there's unfinished business between me and my brother. It doesn't say that you recognize that your brother has a clue, that your brother's right, your brother has a legit. It's if you recognize there's unfinished business between you and your brother, you leave your gift at the altar and you leave your gift and you go make it right with your brother, then you come offer your gift. We've taken the opposite of that. If somebody offends us, we take the impetus to go to them and say, hey, you've offended me. How many times have we taken the initiative to be a peacemaker and say, there's something going on, this person and I have unfinished business, I'm going to go fix it. See, we read Matthew 18 and it says, if your brother sins against you, go to your brother and him alone and tell him his fault. There's two things I'd be interested in. Number one, if your brother sins against you, if it's a heaven or hell issue, you've got an obligation to go confront your brother about it. But if it's some little trivial thing that's not a sin issue, not a heaven or hell issue, then we need to be mature, grow up, and get over it. Matthew 18 is not a hunting license. In fact, the opposite is taught here, that it's not up to the brother to come talk to you, and it's not up to you to go talk to the brother about what he did wrong. It's you go ask your brother, hey, have I done something wrong? If you are bringing your gift to the altar, if you're coming to worship, and you recognize that your brother has something against you, unfinished business, you leave your gift at the altar and you go fix it. In fact, he's going to take it a little further. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and they may throw you into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you've paid the last penny. And the word he uses there was the smallest denomination of a Roman coinage. Jesus says, look, if somebody has unfinished business with you and you can fix it, fix it. Fix it on your way to court. Don't wait till you get in court and drag. Just do what's right and fix things with people. And sometimes in our conflicts with people, we like to take this moral high ground and we turn it into a competition. It's not about a competition. It's, can I fix the situation between me and my brother that's unfinished business? The difference between murder and hate. One is external, one is internal. Verse 22 7. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. The difference between adultery and lust is eventually one of those becomes public. It's just an external thing. Lust is kind of an internal condition. Now, let's make sure we understand, and then there's been a lot of people who take a translation of the Bible that is in Canterbury English, and they don't really understand what it's saying, and a failure to have a modern speech translation has caused lots of religious error to happen. And they camp out on this, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. Think of that as not actually committing adultery, but premeditated adultery. It can't mean what some group of people say, well, if you lusted after a woman, then you're guilty of adultery and your wife can remarry. That's not what this verse teaches. The verse is teaching about the external condition of having an affair, having sexual relations with someone versus lusting after someone, having a fantasy relationship with someone, and one of those is premeditated adultery. Now, if you're one of those people who says, no, that's exactly what the Scripture says, and that's exactly what the Scripture means. If a person intends to become a Christian, it's in his heart to become a Christian, but he dies before he obeys the gospel, is he saved or lost? Well, if God won't grant you righteousness on a intention, God's not going to condemn you on an intention either. Please read this as premeditated adultery and not a literal, emphatic, you have committed adultery. That's not what the verse teaches. What the verse teaches is, if you're out here having an affair and you're out here cheating on your spouse, that's eventually going to be known. But you can have these fantasy ideas, and you can look at people and undress them with your eyes, and you can have an impure heart toward them, and you're not on righteous moral ground. You're guilty of an internal condition that says you're looking at people in a way that is unrighteous and is not acceptable to God. Internals versus externals. What people can only see about you versus what's the secret condition of your heart. And so when Jesus talks to his audience and he talks about lust, and by the way, notice that when Jesus talks about lust, it's always the condition of the heart of the man. He doesn't really do a lot of talking about what the women are wearing. He doesn't really chase a lot of rabbits. In fact, you'll find it hard-pressed that every time that we talk about lust, you can't find it in the New Testament that lust is somebody else's fault, that they're at fault because of how they dressed. It's always the onus, it's always the impetus is put on the man that when you see something that is provocative, you look away. You don't dwell on it. You don't think on it. You do something that shows some self-discipline and some self-control. And so Jesus says, yeah, so most of you guys here would say, yeah, we've never cheated on my wife. How do you look at women? How do you look at females? How do you look at people, and what do you think about them? Are they pure thoughts or are they impure thoughts? Murder versus hate, adultery versus lust. Matthew 5:31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus is basically saying that their law of divorce had been abused. There's two competing rabbis, Shammai and Hillel. They go back to the old law. And the verse in Deuteronomy says, if you find that your wife is displeasing because of some indecent thing, then you write her certificate of divorcement. One of those rabbis, I think it was Hillel, said, if your wife becomes displeasing. He takes that phrase totally out of context and says, if your wife burns the biscuits, if she gains weight, if she changes her hair color, if she does anything that you don't like, you can. Notice in context in the old law, it said, if your wife becomes displeasing because of an indecent thing. And that indecent thing was that you discovered that she'd been sexually impure. Not that she was having an affair. If she'd committed adultery while you were married to her, they stoned her. This is if you found out she'd been a prostitute, if you found out that she'd been promiscuous, if you found out that she wasn't a virgin when you married, and you discovered that she had done some indecent thing, then you could write the certificate of divorcement. Jesus says, unless your wife is guilty of marital unfaithfulness. So that's an unfortunate translation, but in modern speech, we know what unfaithfulness is. It refers to sexual activity. When I perform a wedding ceremony and you use the traditional vows, you go, and do you promise to be faithful only to him, faithful only to her? Well, that means, and we don't like to say it out loud at the wedding ceremony, you promise to only have sex with him the rest of your life. That shocks people. Granny faints. It's a problem. But the idea is marital unfaithfulness deals with sexuality. It doesn't have to do with did she do housework. It doesn't have to do did she pay the bills. It doesn't have to do did this guy go to work every day. Marital unfaithfulness in the context is about sexuality. And Jesus says, unless your spouse, specifically talking to men about women, unless she is guilty of sexual immorality, you can't divorce her and she can't remarry. You can't divorce and remarry either. He'll be more explicit on this in Matthew 19. But the idea is these people were breaking covenant vows that they'd made to a spouse based on their whims. And Jesus said, this is a condition where you've made a promise, and the only thing that violates that promise is if she's guilty of sexual immorality. And the word he uses there in Greek is porneia. And it's not just limited to adultery. It's lots of things that are sexually immoral. And because the words are used when Paul talks about porneia and the letter to the Gentiles talks about porneia, it's a broad term, not just a specific term. And so Jesus says, unless there's sexual immorality in the marriage, you can't divorce and remarry. And if you divorce somebody without those reasons, then the parties that remarry are guilty of adultery. So Jesus has now talked about murder. He's talked about lust. He's talked about divorce. And he's going to go on and talk about oaths. Again, you have heard it said by the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep your oath you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. They had this elaborate system that if you made a vow, if you made a contract, and you swore by the temple, you didn't have to fulfill the vow. But if you swore by the gold of the temple, then you had to fulfill your vow. And they had all these technicalities for how they could get out of contracts and how they could break their promises. And Jesus says, look, you don't have to swear. You have to go through cross my heart, hope to die, pinky swear. Jesus said, if you say yes, it means yes. If you say no, it means no. And if you have to use anything else to reinforce your promises, that's a condition that comes from the evil one. And so when Jesus is talking about internals versus externals, he's even talking about integrity. That it doesn't matter what the technicality of the law says. Is it right or is it not right? Just because I've got the ability to say, oh, you didn't cross the I or dot the T in this contract. What was the intent of your contract? Did you promise to do this? And if you've promised to do it, your yes means yes. Your no means no. And there's no caveat or disclaimer that breaks your obligation from fulfilling the things that you've told people they should do. Integrity. I remember the days when a handshake sealed the deal. I've done some handshake deals. And I've also done the thing where you fill out, 39 different pieces of paper. But the bottom line that Jesus said is the people of the kingdom, they don't go through elaborate stuff like that. Yes is yes. No is no. It doesn't have to go any further than that. And then he talks about retribution. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. We read the Old Testament passage that Jesus is talking about, and it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound. And people have interpreted that as a law of retaliation. In the Old Testament law, the Old Testament covenant people lived under a theocracy. God and civil law were the same thing. And so when God said, if you have somebody and they sin against you civilly, this is the rule. If they knock out your eye, the most you can get from them is an eye. You can't sue somebody for burning you with a cup of coffee. And by the way, the coffee pot at McDonald's was too hot. Anyway, the McDonald's was technically at fault at that one because the coffee pot was too hot. But we've got a litigious society that says, if you hurt my feelings, I can sue you for terrorism. And Jesus says, look, when it comes time to settle up matters, don't go beyond what you're required. Don't go beyond what this person needs. And don't try to say, well, you broke my finger, I'm going to take your arm off. He goes, the Old Testament law's intent was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and you could not get an expansive or an unreasonable judgment against somebody. Jesus says, now, if you're the offender and somebody says, hey, in order to make this right, I need your cloak, offer him your coat. If somebody says, hey, I can make you walk a mile with me, go 2. If somebody has to hit you, you know what? If that made you feel better, hit the other one. Because Jesus is again putting the impetus on us that we become peacemakers, that we initiate solutions. And rather than trying to get more than we deserve or more than is fair in a situation, he said the old law was intended to get an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, not to go excessive. But as people of the kingdom, you do what it takes to not have unfinished business with people. And as much as you have the power, you go the second mile, you offer them your cloak as well as your tunic. And if they have to hit one cheek, let them hit 2. This is about settling disputes between people and not having unfinished business with your brother. And then the last thing we'll cover tonight in this moral thing is from verse 43. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. When you talk about internals versus externals, Jesus gives us that final definition. Now look, you've heard that you have 2 categories of people. People you love, people who are your enemies. These are the people you wave at, these are the people you shoot at. Okay, I'm going to change that. I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Why? In order that you may be sons of your Father. There's an internal locus of control. This is a spiritual self-identity. My being a child of God dictates how I treat you. Your behavior has nothing to do with it. I choose to treat you the way I treat you because my self-identity is I'm a son of God. And if I'm going to be consistent with the idea that I'm a son of God, I treat you in a way that's different. I treat you in a counterintuitive way. It's not that there's a friend and there's an enemy. I'm a son of God. How do I treat you? Well, it doesn't matter how you treat me. How you treat me doesn't come into the clause. How you treat me doesn't factor into the equation. It doesn't matter if you hate me or persecute me or spitefully use me. My job is to love you and pray for you. Why? Well, God does the same thing. The sun rises on the evil and the good. It rains on the just and the unjust. Now, when I was a little boy, I used to read it rains on the just and the unjust. I said, well, the bad people get their picnics rained out just like the good people do. No. This is an agricultural society, and rain was a blessing. When they saw that sky get cloudy and that rain start to come down, they knew they're going to have food. They're going to be able to live. Rain was not a curse. Rain was not a bad thing. And God let it rain. God makes it rain. God gives the rain to the people who are good and the people who are bad. That's the way we should treat people. Not based on how you treat me, but I'm a son of my Father. And how does my Father treat it? The sun shines on us all. We all have the blessing of rain. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get? Even the tax collectors do that. And if you only greet your brothers, what are you doing more than the others? Even the pagans do that. Be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus said, you treat people the way you treat people based on an internal identity. That as a son of God, I'm not going to hate. I'm not going to lust. I'm not going to break my vows. I'm going to let my yes be yes, my no be no, and I'm going to be the peacemaker in my relationships. And so when Jesus begins to talk about your righteousness exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, he attacks the first leg or the first column of their moral superiority, and he says that's an external form of righteousness. Some people call it legalism. And Jesus says, in order to be a son of God, you treat people based on how your Father treats people, not on how people treat you. We'll pick the next version up or the next section up next week, Lord willing. I don't know if we'll be online or live, but we'll talk about the next section where we talk about spiritual disciplines and internals versus externals and how we perform the things that we do on a religious level. We're the Marineville Church of Christ. We're your neighbors. We love you. If we can help you, give us a call. There should be a number on the screen, and reach out to some of us. And we're praying for your health and your safety. And if we can be your neighbor, let us know. Thank you.